Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome this afternoon to Exploring Enduring Issues and Making Connections in Social Studies. We're really glad to have you with us today. As we go through, you're going to have an opportunity to learn a lot of different things about social studies itself and looking at some of the constructed response. If you have questions, please make sure that you write those into the question box so that we can respond to those at the end of the webinar itself. We set aside about 30 minutes in order to do that. My name is Susan Pittman, and I'm going to be your facilitator throughout this webinar today. Daphne Atkinson and Bonnie Goonan will not be with us, or nor Debbie Fawcett, so it's just going to be me today. So let's get started and talk a little bit about what we're going to do in the course of this particular webinar. First of all, you should see that we are using a new system, and hopefully you're hearing us just fine, you're able to go through, but if you're having any difficulties, please make sure that you put a little question in there if you find there's anything that's difficult for you. Now, today what we're going to do is we're going to explore the high impact indicators of social studies. We're going to identify some strategies to help students improve their understanding of enduring issues. And we're going to go through and review some issues and concerns that we have about social studies and those constructed responses as we're moving through. Hopefully by now you have already pulled the materials down and you printed those. You received a little reminder yesterday with a link so that you could go and pull the materials, because we have 4 items for you today, 4 handouts. And if you look on the right side of your panel, you'll actually see that there is a little tab there for handouts, and you'll be able to access those. So let's talk high impact indicators. What are they? Why do we have them, and how does this work as we're moving through? Well, let's talk a little bit about high impact indicators and what they really are. They're truly important skills that are widely applicable across different areas. In fact, in order to go through and do this, what we have is, and I just had my slide slip over here for us, what we had is a look at the chance for what are the students doing who score between 140, 149 compared to those who are scoring 150 to 159. And as we do that, what we're seeing is that there are certain things that students are missing. And quite honestly, we may not be covering them as much in our GED test preparation programs as we really should. So we want to make sure that we're picking into those particular areas so we can make sure that our students go in and they're going to pass that test at the 150 level, 150 to 169, to earn that high school credential. One thing you should know about the high impact indicators is that they really do lend themselves to some straightforward instruction. So this is not something that is going to be really challenging for you to do within the classroom, but it's something that we all need to be aware of, so we make sure that we're touching onto these particular areas. So, you know, last year we talked a lot about most missed items. Well, the high impact indicators, that really replaces the most missed items because we have more information, an additional year of operational data, and there were some analysis filters that make them even more useful to teachers. So let's take a look at what this really is. For those of you who remember back to looking at the assessment guide back when the test first came out, you saw these things called assessment targets. And those targets really design and describe those general concepts that are assessed on the GED test. Now, below those targets, you actually find something that breaks it down a little bit more. And those are called indicators. They're fine-grained descriptions of skills that are contained within an assessment target. Okay, that sounds interesting, but what does that mean? Well, there's another piece to this, and it's called application. And that application, as we have it in the high impact indicators, describes what we should be looking for in students' work. So now we've kind of broken it down into these much finer pieces, and we can really look and assess what our students are doing, where they're having some difficulty, and how we can improve that as we're going through. So let's take a look very quickly, and this actually is in your guide that you hopefully have pulled down, and either you've printed it or you have it on your computer. But we're just going to take and look at a couple of these high impact indicators, and I want you to keep some things in mind as you're looking at these. Think about the reading skills that are required in order to do this. Think about how students would apply this information, not just in social studies, but it could impact in other areas. There are a couple of things that are a little bit different, because if you take a look at that first indicator, it talks about determining central ideas, and notice that it has two things there: primary or secondary source documents. Now, we all know that those primary source documents can sometimes be a little challenging for students, in part because most of the time we view them, we see them as very historical documents, and the language may be different. So we have to work with that. Another thing is that our students may be able to give you a description of some people or places that they read about. However, can they show the connections between and among them? That's another piece that we want our student to recognize. We want them to see those relationships, those connections. Now then we move on a little bit further, and we have cause and effect. And I think for most of you, you probably have the same situation that I did with students, which is that if there was a direct cause and effect one-to-one relationship, my students often saw those. However, if there were multiple causes that led to an effect, they didn't always see those. And so we have to work with that particular area. Another thing is to really look at how we look at historical context. How does that shape what an author's point of view might be? If you think about the context of the time in which that author lived, and what did that author bring into his or her writing? And then we look at social studies in a number of different primary and secondary sources, and look at how those same topics are treated differently based on those particular areas. Now, just a few minutes ago, I made a comment about the fact that, now we have this extra piece, this application. So if we took one of these, just as an example, we do this determining central ideas, hypotheses, and conclusions, and we look all the way to the right, we can see, okay, this is what my student should be able to do. This is what that work should look like, that the student can differentiate between concepts and a main idea, that they understand supporting details that go along with a specific main idea. And there's another couple of pieces, and this becomes really important, especially when we get into the writing component. Can they locate evidence in a text? Can they determine whether that evidence is relevant or it's irrelevant? And then can they use that information in order to support or challenge someone as they're going through? So those are the kinds of things that we want to make sure that we're looking at. So let's take a look a little bit closer as we're moving through, and we'll talk about focusing themes. Because one of the questions that we often get out there is the fact that we have focusing themes. And people want to know, okay, what should I be teaching in the classroom about social studies? Well, in doing this, the GED testing service has actually gone through and they've looked at things and said, okay, we're going to divide off our social studies into two primary themes. One being the development of modern liberties and democracy, and the other one being dynamic responses in societal systems. So when you take a look at those, what do we see? We see across the board in each of those different areas that we have the individual components of social studies, those content areas. So we have civics and government and U.S. history, economics, and geography and the world. So think in terms of in your classroom, how you're going to be able to go through and tie those different areas back to the two focusing themes. So as I look at that and I see modern liberties and democracies, I might think in terms of, okay, that civics and government, the structure and design of our government itself, and I apologize because for some reason this has just popped off, and I'll go back to the previous slide. So as we go through, we look at, okay, modern liberties and democracy and how has that developed over time? Well, if we look at key historical documents, we look at the design of our government, maybe we see how government has changed. Think about the amendments to the Constitution and how that has changed our government over time. Think about how economics have shaped American government and policies. And then as we flip over to dynamic responses in societal systems, we take a look at how would something like the Cold War impact public policy? How did the Cold War impact us with the causes and looking at economic concepts? How did that change the way people moved from one area of the country to another? Those are all things that we look at. So what the focusing themes allow us to do is it really allows us to go in and be able to narrow the focus, and while at the same time covering a lot of different territory. So there is another question that everyone asks as well, and the first thing is, okay, I'm supposed to know about these enduring issues. What are the enduring issues, and what am I supposed to be doing if I'm going to help my students in the classroom with those issues? Well, the reality is this. As we go through, we have enduring issues, and these are major themes that kind of give you a framework, a frame of reference for prompts that may rise. And basically, those major themes as it stands right now focus into civics and government. And think about what a student really can gain from having that knowledge of civics and government and allowing them to learn about individual rights versus the good of the community, or how our government has a separation of powers, that there's certain powers that are granted to the executive branch, there's certain powers granted to the judicial branch, and then to the legislative branch. And then beyond that, there's a system of checks and balances so that one branch can't take control, but rather there's a way to make sure that each power is balanced out. And then last but certainly not least, we have states' rights versus federal power. And within those, we look at what is the right of different states. You know, in Amendment 10, it talks about the fact that certain powers, if they're not granted to the federal government, are the purview of the states. Education is one of those examples. So we need to help our students gain those skills and have that understanding of those enduring issues. Now, when Bonnie and I are working with teachers, what we like to see is we like to see ways that we can go through and actually combine these into a class and think about, okay, how can I make sure that my students really understand enduring issues? So there's one thing that we actually have been doing, and it's something that's very easy for you to do, which is you actually go out and use your favorite search engine doesn't matter whether it's Bing or Google, and put in famous quotes and then put separation of powers or famous quotes and individual rights, and you will get a wealth of different quotations that you can turn around and use in the classroom. This is something that we recommend doing across all different levels. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. So this first one is a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and it is from the letter from the Birmingham jail. And his quote is that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So as we look at that, we're thinking, okay, which one of those 4 different areas would this fall under? Well, it looks to me like he's talking about whatever affects one, that would be an individual, affects all, which goes out and looks at the common good. So we're talking individual rights. But notice that the language that Dr. King uses, that might be a little challenging for students. So this gives us a good opportunity to really talk with students and work through the process in terms of helping them understand the meaning of the text, looking at the different words that are involved there, and really having a discussion around those. Now, this is from James Madison, and it's from one of the Federalist Papers. It's actually Federalist Paper number 51. And if you take just a minute, I'll give you about 15 seconds, take a look at that particular quote. Notice that the quote talks about separate and distinct exercise, and then it says different powers of government. So the words key us in to what this is about, which is the separation of powers itself. Okay, let's take a look at another one. Now this comes from the United States Constitution, and it's Article 6. Again, the text is may be a little challenging for some students. However, if we look through it, we see this big thing in there that says authority of the United States. It doesn't say that you can make treaties by individual states, but the authority of the United States. So now we're looking at that states' rights versus federal power. What we have to do is help students look for and identify specific words that are going to help them as they move through and work to understand this. Now this one is fairly easy because it certainly has a word in there that we can associate with one of those enduring issues and within civics and government. But notice that it says, I say that power must never be trusted without a check. I want you to think for a minute, though. What would that mean in terms of a person who's out there that as soon as they hear the word check, thinks of a check mark or maybe a check as in money? Think how that student might misinterpret what is being said here. Really, this is about checks and balances, but we want to make sure that the student doesn't walk away with the idea of, oh, you can't be trusted without a check, as in without money. So that's an issue that we can look at. So how do you go with this and what do you do? Well, if you set aside 10 minutes per session for the enduring issue of the day, you can have a great discussion with all of your students. This is something that Bonnie and I recommend that you do with a large group activity so that students, irrespective of the level of the students, they can all participate, because students don't need to know about enduring issues just to get ready for the test. They should know about these enduring issues as they're working through and learning more about civics and government for their own personal lives. So identify quote. You could even put that quote up on your board for the day. Have students come in and read the quote and identify that particular issue. And then at some set time, then you go back and you discuss it, and you discuss its meaning. But there's one other thing that you discuss as well. You want to make sure that you help students connect that issue to real life situations. So we're trying to do two things here. One, expand our students' knowledge about enduring issues, but also we want them to see how those issues connect to real life situations, how they relate to their own lives, and what a difference it can make in knowing those. Having said that, I'm going to pull over very quickly because I want to make sure that you're aware that within your materials that you actually have a book that is that you can use in your classroom. It's a resource guide, and what we have done is included some material that I think you will find very useful in looking at those enduring issues. This particular handout is something that you should be using yourself, and it provides not only enduring issues around those four major themes we were just talking about, but it expands it out and it actually includes questions. This is something that was from New York Engage, or Engage New York, their particular website, which is an excellent resource in helping students expand their knowledge of those different enduring issues. So there are different questions that you can ask. Those things are already there. And that page is not set up in your workbook. So make sure that you go back and that you have a chance to look at those. So having said that, let's spend a little bit of time, because once you have those enduring issues and our students understand them, we also need to move over, and we've got to be able to have students put those enduring issues to work for them, because the social studies constructed response asks students to identify an enduring issue based on whatever text that they've read. So let's see how we can put these pieces together. So let's think for just a minute about what our students need to know and be able to do. If they're going to answer a constructed response question, if they're going to be able to read the prompt and respond to it appropriately, they've got to be able to read closely and extract information from that text. And remember, some of this text can be complex, especially when we're looking at those primary sources like the quotes that we just did. They have to analyze what they've read so that they can go through and make sure that they understand that text itself. Then we have to make logical inferences or valid claims. So the student may have to infer based on the information that's there and then develop a claim that goes with it. So now we're looking at how can they evaluate the evidence. Can they go in and do that close reading and make judgments about the evidence that they've pulled? So when we go in, make sure that you're looking at these different areas, and then we'll work on the expressing that information or findings in words. Now, we've had a couple of questions that just came in, and so I want to make sure that we respond to those as we're going through. One of the questions came in and says, do all social studies extended response fit into one of the four categories? And the answer is yes, they do. So we want to make sure that our students have those understandings. Now, one thing I want you to keep in mind is when we talk about individual rights, as we were looking at those, there are lots of different individual rights, like the right to free speech and the right to assemble peaceably, but all of those different things fall under those different categories. So we want to make sure that we're covering those. Now, let's take a next look, because keep that in the back of your mind of how you're going to work those enduring issues into the process itself. So first we're going to start with this thing called close reading. And close reading is something that is done very carefully and very purposefully. And as Dr. Douglas Fisher from San Diego State University says, it's about rereading text. So it's not just reading it one time, but it's really rereading that text. Now, I know some of you may say, but this is a timed test. How are my students going to be able to read and reread something? Well, we're going to work on some skills so that we can help improve our students' reading ability and know that they're going to be focusing in on specific things. So if I'm going to be close reading, what am I going to do? Well, on pages 9 through 11 in your workbook, you will actually find some resources that will help you. The first one on page 9 actually starts with 5 simple strategies of how to read complex text. And later today, you may want to go back and refer to this so that you can take a look at it. But in the meantime, let me just highlight each one of these steps as we go through. First, you need to make sure that as the instructor, find the right text. And when we say find the right text, it really does come back to something that's going to have multiple uses in your classroom, something that is short. You don't want something long and involved, but also something that can bring a number of different, maybe new concepts, new ideas to students. So the example that we've included in the book here actually is FDR's first inaugural address from back in March of 1933. And there's a reason for that, because as you read that text, and this is just an excerpt from it, what you find is that, you have a number of different issues that are very similar to what is going on and has been going on in this country in the past 10 years. So we can show comparisons, and students can see that things that were happening right after the Depression, we had some of the same things happening right after the recession itself. Next, you have to do your pre-work, meaning that you're going to have to take a look at that text and determine, okay, are the paragraphs too long? Do I need to break them up for my students so that they can better understand the text? What kind of questions do I want to ask? I want my students to learn certain things from that text that they're reading, so I need to develop questions to help them with that. And the other thing is there some vocabulary in there that may be a little challenging, and I want to make sure that my students truly understand it. So that's your homework or your pre-work before you go in and work with close reading. Then you want to teach your students to read with a pencil. Now, yes, I know when students get in to take the test itself, they're not taking in a pencil, but they do have a highlighter that allows them to go in and highlight text, the source text that they're reading. So it's really about helping students learn how to do some very basic and simple annotations for text so that they're looking for central ideas and details and evidence, all of those different things. Then you want to make sure after you've read the text that you really talk with students about those text-dependent questions, that's TDQs, so that we can make sure that we are covering all of those different pieces. So let me go back over here so you can get back to the slideshow itself. My apologies. We were, there we go. Sorry. This set of TDQs, or text-dependent questions, are those things that your students need to read the text in order to respond to. They need to make sure it's not just general questions, but rather it's very specific information that can be found in the text. And then last but not least, you want to make sure that you have students write about what they read. Give them an opportunity for practice. Now, it doesn't have to be a multi-paragraph response, but even if they answer a quick question or two and they have to write about what they've read, that's going to make a difference as they move through. So what you want to do is make sure that your students have that opportunity to go through and truly work with a text. Now, I'm going to move back over to the handout one more time, and I'm going to pull down to page 11 just so you can see an example of the text. And I'll give just a second for that to come up into view. And now you should be able to see this is an example of a text that's worth reading. It's worth taking time and doing that close reading. But I might say that as I'm looking at this, that I want to go through and I want to split this big paragraph into two parts because maybe that'll make it easier for students. That's what we call chunking. And as I go through, I may read this as I'm doing my pre-work, and I'll say, well, preeminently, that may be a word that my students don't understand. And they may not quite understand, there's the word candor that's in there. Maybe they're not going to understand that word. I want to make sure ahead of time that I'm looking for those types of things and I can use them with my students. Now, I'm not going to give them a vocabulary list, but I'm going to make sure that something of the questions that I'm asking will refer back to those different vocabulary words that are there. So again, notice that this is not a very long text. It is a text, though, that has a lot of different really strong ideas in it, and it is a primary source. It's a speech. It's an inaugural address. One thing you can add into this is you actually can say, well, I thought inaugurations were held in January. However, as I look at this, what do I see? I see that this address was actually done in March. That gives you an opportunity to talk a little bit about the issues in terms of the Constitution and how that was changed constitutionally so that the inauguration would occur in January, not in March as we're going through. So having said that, I'm going to pull back down to the other page, and I'll get rid of these drawings that are here. And we'll move back over to the PowerPoint. Okay, so having said that, let's talk a little bit about where we can find some really strong text as we're moving through. So I'm going to go back and I want to take you to one little site as we're moving through, and I know that it's a little slow coming in for you at this point, but hopefully you'll see this in just a second as it comes in. If you are not aware of Newsela, then you want to make sure that you have that you access this at some point in time. Newsela, Newsela, is actually an excellent site for finding materials in a lot of different areas. And I'm hoping that this is coming all the way through, and if not, we'll try it again. And let's see if we can get this to come back up in just a minute. And I do apologize that we're having a little bit of problem with our individual slides as we're going through. Okay, now we should be back up with the full screen. Back to Newsella. A couple things I want you to take note of. First of all, you can register for this site with no charge, and you can go through and access different documents. You can even have your students sign up so they can access this as well. But I want you to notice over here to the side, you'll see there's all these different Lexile levels. And these Lexile levels means that I can pull this same story at different grade levels. That means I could work with this with my entire class as I'm going through. So I have War and Peace, sounds like history and all the different areas in social studies to me. I have Money, which talks economics, and also you'll notice they have Law, which gets into civics and government. So there's a lot of different resources, wonderful stories that are very much current information that is interesting to students as they go through. So take advantage of that if you have an opportunity. So let's talk about the students who are getting ready to write that constructed response and how we help with that. So social studies constructed response prompts are very, very specific. So let's take a look at one. Notice that it says in your response, what's the first thing it asks you to do? It asks you to develop. And then what are you developing? Well, you're developing an argument about how the author's position reflects the enduring issue. So that means I have to go in and I've got to find that enduring issue. So then I can go through and take a look at how the author's position in his or her letter reflects that. What's the next thing it asks me to do? Well, it asks me to put in relevant and specific evidence. Remember from the high impact indicators, it said that students need to be able to determine whether evidence is relevant or irrelevant. So this is asking for relevant and specific, but it's asking for it from three different things. An excerpt, which is where the enduring issue is located, the letter, which is the author's position, and then your own knowledge. So our students need to break down those prompts just that way. They need to go through and make sure they identify the verbs and that they're looking at what those verbs are telling them to do. This is the first and one of the most important things that students need to do. Even before they read the source text, look at the prompt. See what the prompt is asking of them, and then they'll know how to proceed from there. So in your guide, you actually have this particular information on pages 14 and 15. You notice on the right-hand side it has the prompt itself just as we went through a few minutes ago. And then on the left-hand side it has the excerpt. Okay, so it's not very long, and it is actually from James Madison. So what can I do to help my students with this particular one? Well, in order to lay a due foundation for that separate and distinct exercise of the different powers of government, which to a certain extent is admitted on all hands to be essential to the preservation of liberty, it is evident that each department should have a will of its own. Whew, that's a lot of words. Not only that, that's an incredibly long sentence as we're going through. So how can we help our students understand that? And how can we get them to extract that enduring issue? Remember, one of those four, so that they can identify this for the prompt itself. Okay, so let's start with looking at some of the words that we actually have there. And notice what we've done on this particular slide, and as it pulls in just a minute, you'll see that there's certain words which have been underlined, and they're also in a different color so that you can see those. And we're a little slow on that. Probably has to do with our weather here. In order to lay a due foundation for that separate, okay, that's a key word for me. Distinct, that's another important word for me. Different powers. Now I've got something else, and if I remember correctly, one of my enduring issues dealt with separation of powers. And then it says each department and a will of its own. Notice that what we've done here is we've actually broken out key words that will help the student then identify what it is that this is telling them. So I'm looking for connections. And as I do that, what I'm seeing is I make a list, and you could use a simple graphic organizer, or actually you could just write this on the board. So I have my enduring issue keywords: separate, distinct, different. Okay, if I think about that, I have 4 different issues. Now, which one would these work with? Well, I don't see anything about individual rights. Not seeing anything about checks and balances. Now, I do have states' rights versus federal power, so that's kind of a separation. But I'm talking about different departments. So, with that in mind, I go for the separation of powers itself, which says that each part of the government has its own separate powers. Okay. So, now I've determined the issue is separation of powers. So let's see where I need to go next. Next I need to read my source text. And this text was actually paired up with a letter from Ralph Roberts to Senator Morse, and it revolved around the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. So I've extracted my issue. Now I'm going to look at this and see what in this tells me something that might refer to a separation of powers. And so as I do, I'm looking at different links within the passage. And just to make this a little easier, we'll look at this particular slide where we have kind of a graph again where I've taken the words and I've linked them. So these are all different pieces that are included in that letter. Notice that we're focusing in, okay, they said Congress. Well, that's one of those parts of the government itself, and then we have president, and then Congress approved and supported the president to do something. But I want you to look at the last 2. The founders gave the fearsome power to declare war directly to the representatives of the American people, and that comes back to Congress. And the founders separated it from the powers of the president. That tells us, yes, here is my link. Here is my connection between the letter and back to the excerpt where I pulled the enduring issue. So let's see what that would look like in a really strong argument. Remember trait 1 for social studies. That's the big focus in this one. And in trait 1, the student has to show that they understand the relationships in the source text and the historical context from which they're drawn. The student has to include relevant and specific evidence, and all of this needs to be well connected to the prompt and the source text. So let's see someone who did. I'm going to give you just a few minutes, just not even a few minutes, but about 30 seconds to just read what you see on the screen. Now remember what the prompt said the student needed to do. The prompt said that the student needed to develop an argument about how the author's position reflects the enduring issue. And we see right off the bat in the first sentence that this student has done so. It says it reflects the issue of the separation of federal powers. Notice how the student has inserted that enduring issue outlined in the excerpt. And then the student went further and said the power to declare war lies not solely with the President, but with the Congress. So the student is showing the connection between those. Okay, that's one part of what I'm looking for, but I also need evidence. So I have to look for evidence within this writing from the student to see if there's really a link between these. So again, just take about 15 seconds and read through this particular paragraph. Remember, we're looking for evidence. And in the first sentence, we pick that up. Notice what the student has said. With Senator Wayne Morris's disapproval, he showed that he would support the Constitution. Okay, one piece. What did he bring in again? No single person should be in charge of the nation. That comes back to the enduring issue, and it's linked right into the letter that the gentleman has written. How about one more? The Constitution applies to every U.S. citizen, no matter what position of power he or she is in. And please, yes, a student does have a problem with the applies and the way he spelled it. However, we're focusing on the ideas here, not back to spelling itself. Let's see if the student actually has any other evidence. Take a look, again, another 15 seconds to read through this one. Once again, we see multiple pieces of evidence coming through. The separation of powers in the United States government is very important to the nation's central values. Johnson's actions in 1964 were unconstitutional. And there were few people who would stand up and say that the Constitution should be upheld no matter the situation. Again, the student is making that link, and that is so important. Now, would a student have to do as much as this student did? No. However, this student has very thoroughly gone through to show the connection between the excerpt and enduring issue and the letter. So let's look at one more thing, because this is something that without personal knowledge included, that's somehow connected back to that enduring issue, this student could not receive a 2. So let's take a look at this paragraph and see if there's some places where the student did. And as you go through and take a look at this, I want you to notice a couple of different things. The student actually refers back here when the U.S. Constitution was written. Notice what the student has said from there. There's nothing from the letter or the excerpt itself, but it's really something the student knew. Also, as you move through here, and we look and we start with President Johnson had no right to take military action before an approval of the declaration of war against North Vietnam. And the student goes one step further. And although The student should have at this point been referring to the Cold War, not the Red Scare. There's still an understanding that there was a link between North Vietnam and that concern about the spread of communism. So the student did have an idea and could make that connection in that particular case. So we have this student who has been able to go through and make the connections as he or she worked through the material itself. So what would you score this student? Well, this student does get a 2 for trait 1. This particular response, as you looked at it and you looked at those individual pieces, generated a clear argument. It was obvious the student understood how those ideas and events were all connected in the source text. The student cited relevant and specific evidence, but you didn't see lots of quotes. What you saw is that student going back and citing that evidence and paraphrasing as opposed to just using a lot of quotes. And the student was able to come further and do that historical information that didn't come from the source text itself, but came from the student's own understanding of what was going on at that point in time. So, how do we help our students? Well, there are a couple different things that you can do. You can review the sample responses from the GED testing service, the Social Studies Resource Guide. That is one of the first things that Bonnie and I did, is we actually went through and we read all of those different responses, so we got a really good feel for it. And you want to take a look at the annotations that are included. That gives you real good information about what they're looking for at those different score points. Help students understand the prompts. If they can go through and do what we just did, which was to unpack it by looking at the verbs and can really focus on that, it's going to make a big difference in what students are doing. Students are going to need to practice identifying central ideas and supporting evidence. And that really does come down to practice. The more students work with different texts, the better they're going to be in the long run. And they have to be able to do an analysis and evaluation and not just a summarization of the material. Our students want to summarize rather than to analyze it, to take it apart and understand what it means and then evaluate whether or not evidence is important or not. Those are two skills that we have to work on with our students. Anytime you have an opportunity for students to read, have them write at least a sentence or two about what they've read. Practice, practice, practice. It will make a huge difference for students in the long run. Use the rubrics and the scoring tools when you evaluate student work. Whether that student is doing a GED Ready test or you have the student working on having just read a social studies text and now you want them to come back and actually write something. Use a rubric. Keep that in your mind so that you're focusing and the student is focusing on certain things that need to be there. Discuss those enduring issues. If you can set aside time, each class session, just 5 or 10 minutes, that can be a wonderful opportunity for students to really gain knowledge in the area of social studies and especially in civics and government. And like you said, you want to have ample practice in class. Newsella is a wonderful source because with so many different levels that most of you have in your classrooms, it can make a huge difference for students to be able to practice, and everybody working with the same story is just at different grade levels or different lexiles. So that makes a difference as well. And keep in mind that there's a link here between constructed response in RLA and also social studies. There's a big focus on trait 1. Our students have to be able to develop those arguments and they have to find the evidence. They've got to show a connection, explain how that evidence connects to the argument. So when you're working with RLA, that's also helping students gain skills for social studies as well. The prompts may be a little different, however, much of what they're doing is very, very similar. In your book, you actually have a number of different resources from the field. They're graphic organizers, they're writing frames, they're sample prompts and stimulus materials, and you really want to take a look at those because I know I was always looking for different materials that I could use and different teaching models as well. I mentioned just a few minutes ago how important it is to go back and to take a look at some of the materials from the GED testing service. The Extended Response Resource Guide, if you'll notice, it's been updated. It was updated in May of 2015, so you have even more annotations that are included in there, which is fantastic. They're also on the GED website right now. You can pull in, and if you downloaded the documents for this particular webinar, you actually saw some sample passages. You have 5 new sets of materials that you can use to help as you work with students. And then the other thing that's included, which we can't forget about, are those extended response answer guidelines. Every student should have a copy of that. They should know exactly what is expected of them as they're working through. And then a couple of other things that you may want to use as resources. KET, Adult Education, has professional development videos that are included there, online courses. So you may want to take advantage of those. They're all free, pbslearningmedia.org, and you can actually go in, and there is one that focuses on social studies. There's another one that focuses on science. That may be something that you want to do. Another one is a wonderful resource out of Appalachian State University. They actually have put together some great extended response materials. There's a video that walks students through the process, and they've also provided a number of different responses and speeches and lots of different resources that you can use. Another thing that it can be helpful, Florida has a website. It's called IPDA, which is the Institute for the Professional Development of Adult Educators, and there are some lesson plans that are available on that website, so you don't have to create the lesson. So at this point, what I'm going to do is we have some questions that are already in the loop, and so I'm going to go ahead and answer some of those, or do my best to answer some of those, and we'll see what we can do in terms of helping. Let's see, let me go back to how do you recommend teaching these enduring issues when the GED is taught in an open forum versus specific classes? What I will say to you is that's fine. When you have an open forum, I would go right ahead and include it as a part of that. I know that many of us have multi-level classrooms and students are working on lots of different things. However, most of our students, whether they're ABE students or ESOL students or our GED students, they all need this kind of knowledge that can be very helpful to them as they're moving forward in life, and that they know more about civics and government itself. So again, if you have an open forum, set aside a specific time that you're going to do the enduring issue of the day. So maybe your class runs from 9 till noon on a given day, and so at 10:15 is going to be time for anybody who wants to participate, or everybody, hopefully, in the classroom takes 10 minutes to work on this. Now, some students might miss out because they've already left or they haven't gotten there yet, but it does provide an opportunity for everyone to participate, irrespective of what level they're functioning at or what content they're working on. It's just kind of like a brain break for everyone. Hopefully that helped as we're going through. The next one is Let me pull down to the next question. I have several students that are slow readers. How do I help them on these timed readings for social studies and RLA? Well, students who are slow readers, one of the realities that we have to look at is that we need to help our students improve their reading rate. Because research shows us very clearly that reading rate has an impact on understanding and on comprehension. So there are a number of different tools that you can use out there. There's some activities that you can do that are specifically for timed reading. You may want to consider that. I know that there is one that's out there, Marshall Adult Education, that you can go online, and they have timed readings that are part of a special grant program that they set up. They're all free. And students read and keep, the idea to bring up your reading speed is all about practice. And so that's going to help our slower readers improve their skills, so in turn this is not going to be an issue. The other thing to keep in mind too is that when it comes to the constructed response for RLA and also for social studies, yes, there is a time frame that's set for those, 45 minutes for RLA, 25 minutes for social studies. However, many of our students are not using all the time allotted to them. So it's not a matter of students just running out of time. They're not even using all the time they have granted to them. But to improve the writing itself, the reading rate itself, you can use timed reading activities. If you go out on the web and just do a search for timed readings, you'll find that there are publishers. Jamestown Publishers has one. There's some others that are online that would be helpful to you. And again, it's all about practice and how often we can get students to work with it. The next question is, will the connection always be that the source text reflects the enduring issue? Would it possibly conflict with or disagree with the enduring issues? In other words, would there be other kinds of connections made? That's one question that I'm going to ask the GED testing service to respond to specifically, and so we'll make sure that that answer gets posted out there to the frequently asked questions. But what I will tell you is that all of the things that we have seen show that there is a connection, and it's how the student connects the enduring issue to that. Not that there's a disconnect in this, but rather that there is a connection. So at this point, we don't have that to worry about. I'm not going to say never, that we might at some point in the future have something where we would have that. But right now, it is all about connecting the text, the source text, back to that enduring issue in the excerpt. Is it a teacher's responsibility to find speeches, etc., to create lessons? Why can't we have a curriculum to follow rather than everyone, and I assume it's everyone creating their own? That's one of the reasons why we wanted to share with you a couple of the different websites today. One of those being from Appalachian State, which you saw on the slide itself, because Steve Schmidt and the team there at Appalachian State have done a great job in pulling information that I think you'll find extremely useful. So I'm like you, why recreate the wheel as you're going through? But again, you don't need to do lots of different examples of speeches like the one that we did here for FDR, but that's just an example. One that you might find very useful for you is to actually go to I'm trying to think of the name of the website now. Anyhow, it's Dr. King's website. It has a lot of the Dr. King's papers on it, and actually pull an excerpt from Letter from the Birmingham Jail. It's the liberationcurriculum.org. That's where you need to look. liberationcurriculum.org, and we'll type that into the chat function for you. But that's one site where you can find a number of different resources that go along with the letter from the Birmingham jail, which I think would be very useful to you. Again, you're not trying to find lots of different speeches. what you really want to do is help students with a couple of different things, and then make sure you teach it to a deeper level. Much better to take on maybe FDR speech, the use the example prompt that we had here today with the Federalist paper that was quoted, and then also something like Letter from the Birmingham Jail, and actually dig deeper into the reading of that so students understand how to extract meaning than to use lots of different things. But the other thing is that the resources from Appalachian State will be very helpful to you. One other thing to keep in mind, if you take a look in your the book itself, your resource book, what you will also find in there, starting on page 22, you have a number of different prompt and stimulus materials, some of which were developed by Appalachian State University, and they're all included here, also with some examples, so that should get you started. Any other questions? Please make sure that as you go through and you have questions, if you want to go ahead and pass those on to us, we'll do our best in answering those questions. But also keep in mind always that you can communicate with the GED testing service if you have questions after you leave today. You can always go back and ask those questions via one of those particular outlets itself. So let me go back very quickly, and I want to pull up one item for you, and it is going to be coming up in just a second. We are so incredibly pleased that the GED testing service has actually put together new passages that we can use in the classroom. So take advantage of those. That is one of the documents that you have, sample extended response passages and prompts for classroom practice. We love it as we're going through that we have these materials. So there are 5 different sets of materials here. So you have the source material. You may have the excerpt where they find the enduring issue, and then you have the source material to go with that. One thing I want to point out to you on this particular one, notice that it says here that the Social Studies ER prompt often requires 3 to 5 paragraphs, and it can quickly add up to 200 to 400 words of writing. One thing we want to make sure that students do is that they don't focus on the number, but they understand it takes more than a paragraph to do an extended response. That the student is going to need to work through, identify the enduring issue, make the connections, explain why, and you just can't do that in 1 or 2 paragraphs. So it does provide you with some guidelines. The other document that we mentioned, excuse me, earlier was also the extended response answer guidelines, and those, please provide those to your students so that they know exactly what the GED testing service is asking of them as they go through and develop their argument. I think this would be something very useful to students so they know what they're striving for, what they're working toward as they're moving through. So having said that, I'll ask one more time if there are any other questions. And I don't see, I was trying to see if there is anything else. I do see one in here. 25 minutes doesn't seem like enough time to read the material and analyze it and then construct a thorough response. Actually, it is enough time because we are not looking at the type of argument that students are asked to develop when it comes to working with the RLA. Remember, in RLA they have 2 long source texts, and from those 2 source texts they have to set up an argument, determine which is a better supported position. In the social studies it is different because it asks them, 1, to read a very short excerpt, which is where the enduring issue is located. That's never a long piece. That's always short. Then they have a letter, or they have a speech, or they have something that connects to it. So they're making the connections there. And the other comment is, are you aware if there are any complaints regarding the time limit? And there haven't been. So that is something that you're going to want to do. We have a question from Oscar who says, do you have this information in Spanish? And the answer to that is yes, we do. That information is included in Spanish on the GED Testing Service website. So if you go out to gedtestingservice.com and go under Educators, you'll be able to pull the information in Spanish as well. I'm trying to see. If we have any other things that are in there. Oh, I do have one. And Dora, thank you very much for bringing that up, because it says, do you think that providing the extended response answer guidelines could be a bit overwhelming for some students? Yes, they could be a little bit overwhelming for some students, especially some of our lower level students who are really in the ABE levels, but all of our students consider themselves GED students because that's what they're striving for. And so it may be something that you share with students a little bit later as they're getting more prepared for taking GED Ready. You'll have to judge that with some of your students if you feel like that is just a little bit too much. But the main thing is to always focus your instruction toward those different guidelines that are there. That's going to help students tremendously as they go through. Okay, and I believe that is the last of our questions that are there. We want to thank you for being with us today. As I said earlier, if you have any additional questions, you can always send those to communications@gedtestingservice.com. We will be having another webinar next month, so make sure that you're ready to join us. I think next month we're working on science, so lots of different things that will be coming in. Don't forget, make sure that you've downloaded the materials if you haven't already done so, and that you take an opportunity to look at all the different resources that are available. So having said that, on behalf of the GED Testing Service and everyone out there who's working so hard to help our students as they move forward, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next month.